The snow came in sideways through the spruce until the trail she had been following disappeared beneath her boots. Adelaide Whitmore pressed one shoulder against the flank of an old mule that had already begun to fail on the ice. When his forelegs went from under him, the halter rope tore through her mitten, and the mule scrambled up and ran back down the mountain without her. She was 21 years old that morning alone on Copper Ridge, and no one in Silverbow Crossing knew where to begin to look. The cold moved into her fingers first, then behind her eyes, then into the quiet part of her mind that had already begun to consider sitting down. It was in that white dark that she saw the line, one straight horizontal edge, in a country where nothing was horizontal. She fumbled along the buried wall until her mitten found an iron latch that lifted too easily to be forgotten. The door groaned inward on hinges that someone had recently oiled. The morning of October 14th, 1884, arrived in Silverbow Crossing the way most mornings arrived in the mining camps of western Montana Territory. That autumn, quietly without ceremony, wrapped in a thin fog that clung to the tin roofs of the assay office and the low-pitched roofs of the boarding houses along Miners Row. A single bell rang somewhere near the stamp mill east of town, marking the change of shift for the men who worked the veins beneath the Bitterroot foothills. Smoke from a dozen chimneys rose in slow gray columns into a sky the color of pewter. Somewhere down at the freight yard, a mule brayed once, then fell silent, as though the sound itself had frozen halfway up into the pines. Inside the second story of Hollis House, a narrow boarding establishment squeezed between the barber shop and the freight office, Adelaide Whitmore lay awake beneath a thin wool blanket and listened to the town waking without her. She had been awake since well before the bell. That was the trouble with sleeping in a room the size of a broom closet. Every sound from the street below found its way through the pine boards. Every laugh from the saloon 3 doors down, every wagon wheel over frozen ruts. Della, as everyone called her, when they bothered to call her anything at all, had learned to sleep through most of it. What she had never learned to sleep through was the silence that followed. The silence after the last drunk stumbled home. The silence in the hour before dawn when a person had only her own thoughts for company, and her own thoughts on this particular morning were not good company at all. She sat up slowly. The floorboards were cold against her feet. She wrapped her shawl about her shoulders, crossed to the small square of glass that served as her window, and rubbed a circle clear in the frost. Down in the street, a boy she did not know was scattering ashes from a bucket onto the icy patches near the water trough. He wore a coat too large for him, the sleeves rolled twice. She watched him for a long moment, thinking nothing in particular until he glanced up and saw her, then ducked his head, embarrassed as though he had been caught looking at something he was not meant to see. She stepped back from the window. On the small pine dresser sat the only 2 objects in the room that belonged to her rather than to Mrs. Hollis. A leather-bound notebook, the corners softened by 3 years of handling, and a small silver locket on a tarnished chain. She lifted the locket first. It was oval, no larger than the pad of her thumb, with 2 letters engraved in a fine script on the front A. The chain was too short to fasten properly behind her neck, but she looped it once and let it rest against her collarbone. Then she closed her fingers around it. She had done this every birthday for as long as she could remember. She was not certain why. Perhaps because it was the only thing in the world that had touched her mother's hands. Perhaps because on this one morning of the year, a person was allowed to hold on to whatever small proof she had that she was real. 21 years old today or so, the sisters had reckoned it. The number felt strange in her mind, heavier than 20 had felt, though she could not have explained why. 20 had still been the age of a girl. 21 in the eyes of the law and the church and the freight clerks who kept ledgers was the age of a woman grown. A woman was expected to have a place. A husband, perhaps, or a household, or at the very least a family, somewhere who would send a letter on her birthday. Della had none of these things. She had a room over a saloon in a silver camp in Montana Territory, a wage of $1.40 a week, and a silver locket engraved with initials that might not even be hers. The story as she had pieced it together over the years went like this. On a February night in the winter of 1863, a bundle had been left on the steps of St. Bridget's Catholic Church in St. Louis, Missouri. The bundle contained a female infant, perhaps 3 days old, wrapped in a wool shawl that was not warm enough for the weather. Pinned to the shawl was a scrap of paper with a single word written on it in a shaking hand, Adelaide. Around the infant's neck, on a chain far too large for her, hung the silver locket. There was no note. There was no follow-up. There was no one who ever came back. The Sisters of St. Bridget's had taken her in for a season. When they could not keep her, she had been passed to a Protestant orphan asylum on the outskirts of the city. From there, she had gone to 3 different farm families in Missouri, then to a widow in Kansas, then west by Wagon at the age of 13 with a preacher's family who had abandoned her at a stage stop in Wyoming when the preacher's wife decided the girl reminded her too much of a sorrow she preferred to forget. By the age of 16, Della was on her own in the territory of Montana, taking whatever work a girl could take without shame. Laundry mending, kitchen scrubbing, the copying out of receipts for merchants whose eyes were too tired to write. The sisters had chosen her name day for her long ago, on the feast of the saint, on whose steps she had been left, and she had never had cause to celebrate any other. October the 14th. As good a birthday as any invented one. She dressed slowly. The dress was gray wool mended twice at the elbows, cinched at the waist, with a strip of leather she had cut herself from a broken bridle. Over it went the apron over that, the shawl over that, the coat that had once belonged to a man named Peterson, who had died of pneumonia in room number 3 the previous winter. Mrs. Hollis had given the coat to Della on the condition that she never speak of where it had come from. Della had agreed. She did not mind wearing a dead man's coat. What she minded was that no one had come for his things when he died. That more than anything was the fate she feared. Downstairs, the boarding house kitchen was already warm with the smell of coffee and bacon grease. Mrs. Prudence Hollis, a woman of perhaps 65, stood at the great iron stove stirring a pot of oats. She wore her hair pinned back so severely that it seemed to pull the corners of her mouth down along with it. She glanced up as Della entered, then looked back at the pot. Room 4 wants their linens changed before noon. The Kirby brothers checked out. You'll find the room in a state. No greeting, no good morning. She had not asked, and Della had never told her that this was the day. Della took her small tin cup of coffee from the sideboard, wrapped both hands around it, and stood for a moment near the stove for warmth. Outside the kitchen window, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing the raw wooden false fronts of Silverbow Crossing in all their unlovely honesty. It was not a town that pretended to be more than it was. It had been thrown up quickly 6 years earlier when silver had been struck in the Copper Ridge diggings, and it would be torn down just as quickly when the veins ran thin. Everyone in Silverbow knew this. It was a place people passed through, not a place people stayed. Della drank her coffee. She thought about telling Mrs. Hollis. She thought about it every year, and every year she did not. There was no point. Mrs. Hollis was not unkind exactly, but she was a woman who had learned long ago that the world required a certain economy of feeling, and she did not spend her feelings on girls who worked for wages. If Della told her, Mrs. Hollis would nod, might even offer a hard peppermint from the tin she kept in the cabinet. That would be the end of it. Della had decided some years back that a hard peppermint given out of duty was worse than no peppermint at all. It reminded her too much of the way the sisters at St. Bridget's had patted her head at Christmas, kindly briefly on their way to somewhere more important. She set down the empty cup. She fetched the linen basket from the pantry. She climbed the stairs to room number 4. The Kirby brothers had left the room the way she had known they would leave it. A bottle rolled beneath the washstand. Boot prints of dried mud tracked from door to bed. The chamber pot had been used and not covered. Della opened the window first, letting the cold air rush in and do the worst of the work for her. Then she stripped the bed. She worked without hurry, without complaint, moving with the practiced economy of a person who had made 10,000 beds in her life and would make 10,000 more. She was folding the second sheet when she heard the boots in the hallway. She knew the tread before she saw the man. Slow, heavy, deliberately loud, as though every footfall was meant to announce something. The knock at the door was worse. It was not a knock so much as a suggestion. 3 light taps, almost playful, from a hand that did not need to knock because the door was already ajar. Cyrus Fenwick stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. He was perhaps 45 broad through the shoulders, clean-shaven in a country where most men were not. His coat was of black broadcloth, cut in a style 2 years out of date in Chicago, but still fresh enough to draw the eye in Silverbow. He smiled at her with the smile of a man who had been told often and by many that his smile was pleasant. Della had learned early to distrust such smiles. Miss Whitmore, forgive the intrusion. I heard the sound of industry, and I thought perhaps I might have a word. His voice was low-cultured, the voice of a man who had schooling somewhere back east and had never quite let anyone forget it. Della kept folding the sheet. She did not look up. The room's not made ready yet, Mr. Fenwick. You'd best come back. It's not the room I've come about. He stepped inside. He did not close the door, a small courtesy calculated to reassure, which had the opposite effect. I've been thinking on our last conversation. I believe I may have expressed myself poorly. She could feel him studying her back. It was a sensation she had come to know well in 3 years at Hollis House, the weight of a man's looking heavier than any linen basket she had ever carried. She turned then. She turned because she had learned that turning away only invited more. You expressed yourself plain, Mr. Fenwick. I understood you clear. The smile did not leave his face, but something behind it shifted the way shallow water shifts when a fish moves beneath the surface. A woman of your quality shouldn't be spending her mornings in another woman's linens. That's all I meant to say. There are households in Helena where a girl with your penmanship could earn in a month what she earns here in a year. I know several such households. I could speak a word. She folded the pillow slip in half, then in quarters. She set it in the basket. I have a position, sir. You have a task, Miss Whitmore. That is a different thing. The distinction landed somewhere beneath her ribs. She would have preferred a blow. A blow could be answered. A distinction spoken by a man in a black broadcloth coat could not be answered without turning oneself into the small, foolish thing he had already decided she was. I thank you for your interest. Her voice level, her hands still moving. But I've work to finish before the noon meal. He watched her for a moment longer. Then he set his hat back on his head with a small nod, as though he had accomplished exactly what he had come for. A very happy birthday to you, Miss Whitmore. He was gone before she could ask him how he had known. She sat down on the edge of the strip mattress and pressed her palms flat against her knees to stop them from shaking. The ledger. Of course. She had signed the ledger downstairs when she had first come to Hollis House 3 years ago this month, and Mrs. Hollis kept every ledger she had ever kept in the small locked cabinet behind the front desk. Any guest with a coin for the housekeeper could have looked. Fenwick had looked. He had known her birthday before she herself had thought to speak it aloud, and he had used it the way a man uses a small tool to pry open a small door, to remind her that he knew things about her, and she knew nothing about him except what she did not want to know. She rose. She finished the room. She carried the basket down the back stairs to the wash yard behind the boarding house, where the copper kettle sat on its iron ring above a bed of coals. She dumped the linens and added lye soap from the crock and began to stir with the long wooden paddle. The work was hard on the shoulders. She was grateful for the hardness. It gave her something to push against. By the time the noon dinner bell rang, she had made her decision. She would leave. She had been thinking of leaving for months, really. The letter from Fort Benton had come in August, a circular from the Ladies' Aid Society there, announcing that the little school on the Missouri River bottoms was seeking an assistant teacher for the winter term. $12 a month, room and board included in the house of a Mrs. Amelia Coates' widow. The circular had been left on the front desk by a traveling drummer, and Della had folded it small and tucked it inside the leather notebook, and she had looked at it perhaps 100 times since. $12 a month, room in a widow's house. Children who would learn from her because she had learned first from herself in whatever books she could beg or borrow, and who would call her Miss Whitmore. Not because it was a title of contempt, but because it was a title of trust. She had $18 saved. It would be enough for the stage fare to Fort Benton by way of Deer Lodge, with a little left over for boots. The trouble was the stage did not run until the second week of November, and the winter had already come early. If she waited, she might be trapped in Silverbow until spring. If she went now on foot, she could reach the Ashby Ranch on the far side of Copper Ridge in 2 days walking. The Ashbys were said to be a decent couple retired from the cattle drives of the 70s, keeping a small horse operation on the far slope. She had never met them. She had heard their names spoken with the peculiar respect Montana men reserve for people who paid their debts and did not brag. If she could reach them, she could ask for a week's work in exchange for shelter and a place to sit out the worst of the season. From their spread, she could catch the freight wagons that ran the Mullen Road down toward Missoula, and from Missoula, she could take the stage north to Fort Benton in the spring. It was a plan built of thin threads, but it was a plan, and it was hers, and no one in it wore a black broadcloth coat. She served the noon meal. She washed the dishes. She dried them. She went upstairs and packed her things into a canvas satchel, 2 dresses, a change of linen, the notebook, a stub of pencil, a small tin of matches wrapped twice in oilcloth, a folding knife with a bone handle that had been a Christmas gift from a farrier in Kansas, whose name she could no longer remember, a length of twine, a comb, a rag of soap. She wrapped the last of yesterday's bread and 2 hard-boiled eggs in a square of muslin. She put on the dead man's coat. She left 3 coins on the pillow, the last of what she owed for the week's board. And she wrote a short note that said, "Only I thank you for the shelter. I will send word from where I go." She signed it with her full name, Adelaide Whitmore, in the careful copper plate she had taught herself out of a merchant's ledger when she was 14. She left by the back stairs. Mrs. Hollis was in the front parlor with the sewing circle. Mr. Fenwick, she knew, was down at the assay office where he spent his afternoons on business she did not care to guess at. No one saw her go. At the livery, she paid 2 bits for the use of a mule named Barnaby, an animal so old and so patient that the hostler laughed when she asked if he could carry her over the ridge. "Ma'am, if that mule can't get you there, then it can't be got to." He gave her a sack of oats and a strip of dried beef from his own dinner on the house because he had known her for 2 years and she had once mended his shirt without charge. Small kindnesses. She had been kept alive on small kindnesses her whole life, and today she carried a full ledger of them, and she was grateful for everyone. She was 3 miles out of Silverbow, past the last of the tailings piles, when she looked back for the final time. The town lay in a shallow bowl of yellow grass and blackened stumps, its false fronts made small by distance, its chimney smoke drifting east toward a sky that had begun subtly to change. There was no one on the road behind her. There was no one on the road ahead. Barnaby's hooves rang on the frozen ground with a hollow patience that seemed almost like company. She turned her face into the wind and she went on. The trail up Copper Ridge was not the wagon road the freighters used. That road cut around the shoulder of the mountain in a long, lazy curve, adding 8 miles for the sake of an easier grade. Della took the shorter track. The miners cut a footpath that switchbacked up through the aspen and into the spruce. It was steep enough that she dismounted after the first mile and led Barnaby by the halter. The old mule accepted this arrangement without complaint. He seemed to understand, in the way that mules sometimes understand, that they were engaged in an enterprise larger than either of them had bargained for, and that his role was to place one hoof after another and to have opinions about none of it. The aspen leaves had already fallen. They lay in drifts of pale gold across the trail, muffling the sound of her boots. The air tasted of wood smoke from some distant camp, and beneath the wood, smoke of something colder and cleaner, the taste that mountain air takes on when the barometer is falling. Della noted it without alarm. She had lived long enough in this country to know the smell of coming weather. What she did not yet know, though her body was beginning to suspect, was how fast the weather was coming. By 2 in the afternoon, she had climbed above the aspen line and into the spruce. The trees here stood taller, darker, their lower branches gray with hanging moss. The light beneath them was already the color of late evening. She stopped at a small clearing to breathe and to drink from the tin cup she carried at her belt. She poured a little water from her canteen into her cupped palm and offered it to Barnaby, who accepted it with the grave dignity of a small king receiving tribute. It was in that moment, standing in the clearing, with the mule's warm breath on her hand, that she noticed the silence. There should have been birds. She had climbed this ridge in her mind 100 times out of the memories of other ridges in other winters, and every one of those memories had held the sound of birds. Chickadees in the low branches, a jay's rasp somewhere off in the timber, the high, thin call of a nuthatch working its way down a trunk. Here now there was nothing, not one bird, not one call. The forest was holding its breath the way forests do when something is coming that they do not wish to be caught in. She looked up. Between the spruce tops, the sky she had left behind in Silverbow, the pale pewter sky of morning was gone. In its place was a low ceiling of cloud moving fast from the northwest, the underside of it torn into long trailing streamers that hunters called mare's tails, though her Kansas foster father had called them by another name, a name she had forgotten, a name that meant snow within the hour. She weighed the distance in her mind. She was perhaps 2/3 of the way to the crest of Copper Ridge. On the far side of the crest, another 4 miles down through timber, lay the upper meadow of the Ashby place. Behind her, 6 miles back, lay Silverbow. She had committed to the crossing. To turn back now was to arrive at Hollis' house after dark in weather, with a story she did not want to tell. To go forward was to gamble that the storm would break gently, that she could reach the timbered slopes on the far side before the trail became impassable, that Barnaby's old legs would carry her 1 more hour. She went forward. The first snowflake fell 15 minutes later. It landed on the back of her wrist as she reached to tighten Barnaby's halter, and she looked at it, a single crystal, six-arm perfect, and she thought with the small clarity that sometimes comes at the edge of a mistake that she had never in her life seen a snowflake she wanted to remember, and that she would remember this one. It melted. Another fell, then 3, then 100. The trail began to disappear. Not slowly, not the way a trail disappears in a gentle snow, softening at the edges, still visible if a person knows what to look for. This snow came in on a wind that struck sideways through the timber, and it filled the trail, the way a man fills a shot glass, quickly, deliberately, without spilling. Within 20 minutes, Della could no longer see the ground beneath her boots. Within 30, she could no longer see the tree she had passed a moment before. She kept the mule's shoulder against her hip. She kept her eyes on the ground 3 feet ahead. She had read once in a survival account written by an army surgeon who had crossed the Bighorns in the winter of '76 that a person lost in a storm should never trust her sense of direction because her sense of direction would lie to her. The surgeon had written that a person should instead trust the slope of the ground. Uphill was uphill, downhill was downhill. If she could keep the ground rising beneath her boots, she would eventually reach the crest, and from the crest, any direction that led downhill would lead to timber, and timber meant shelter. She kept the ground rising beneath her boots. She lost count of time. The wind stopped seeming like wind and began to seem like a hand, a large, cold, impatient hand that pushed at her from the left and then from behind, and then worst of all from the front, as though it had grown tired of pushing and had decided instead to lift her off the mountain altogether. Barnaby made a sound she had not heard him make before, a low, complaining sound that was not quite a bray. She spoke to him. She did not remember afterward what she had said. Something soft, something meant to reassure them both. He steadied. Then, without warning, his forelegs went from under him. He had struck a slab of ice beneath the new snow. The old mule went down onto his knees hard, and the sudden jerk of the halter rope ripped the leather through Della's mitten and took a strip of skin from the base of her thumb. Barnaby scrambled. She lunged for the rope. Her boot found the same slab of ice her mule had found, and she went down 2 sideways into a drift that had already gathered to the height of her waist. By the time she rolled to her knees spitting snow, Barnaby was up. He was up, and he was moving away from her down the slope back the way they had come. The rope trailed behind him through the drifts. His pack with the oats and the dried beef and half her matches was still cinched to his back. She called his name once, twice, a third time. She heard, or thought she heard, one answering complaint from somewhere in the white, and then the mule was gone, and she was alone with her satchel and her folding knife and what remained in her pockets. She stayed on her knees for a moment. She let herself understand. Then she got up. Panic was for people who had time for panic. She had read that too somewhere, or perhaps she had made it up out of necessity. She took a slow accounting. She had the satchel across her body, 2 dresses, a change of linen, the notebook, the folding knife twine, comb soap, half a loaf of bread wrapped in muslin, 2 eggs, the tin of matches wrapped twice in oilcloth. She had the dead man's coat. She had wool stockings, wool mittens, a wool shawl beneath the coat. She had the locket. She had in a small oilskin pouch pinned inside her bodice, the last of her savings, $18 in mixed coin. None of it would buy her a fire in a blizzard on a mountain where the trail no longer existed. She had to keep moving. To stop moving was to freeze. She knew this the way a child knows to pull her hand back from a stove. She turned her face into the wind again because the wind was coming from the direction of the ridge, and the ridge was still the only direction that mattered, and she walked. She could not have said how long she walked. Later she would guess an hour. It might have been 2. The light thickened until she could see only the shape of the nearest tree, then only the shape of her own outstretched hand. Her thighs began to ache in a way that was no longer honest pain, but the numb suggestion of pain, the kind of pain that meant the muscles beneath were beginning to go. Her fingers inside the mittens had passed from cold to burning to a dull, heavy nothing that frightened her more than the burning had. She began without deciding to begin to talk to herself under her breath. Small sentences, practical ones. Left foot, right foot, watch the ground, do not sit down. If you sit down, you will not get up. Do not sit down. She thought once of her mother. She did not know why. She had not thought of her mother, not truly, not with any particular hunger, since she had been perhaps 12 years old, and had understood finally that the woman who had left her on the church steps was never coming back and had probably never been coming back. Yet here in the white, with her cheeks past the point of feeling, she thought of her mother, and she found that what she felt was not anger, which was what she had felt at 12, but something else, something older, something that felt almost like sympathy. Her mother, whoever she had been, had put her down on a church step in a February storm because she could not carry her further. Della understood that suddenly in a way she had not understood it before. She was on her own storm now. She too was carrying something she was not sure she could carry to the end. She did not sit down. The prayer, when it came, surprised her. She had not prayed, not in earnest, since she was small. The sisters had taught her the words, and the Protestant orphanage had taught her different words, and by the time she was 14, she had decided that words for God were like words for weather. They described the thing without changing the thing, and a person might as well save her breath. Yet here in the white, with her lips too stiff to shape a proper sentence, she found herself speaking, or almost speaking, or shaping in her mind alone, the oldest of the words the sisters had given her. She did not ask to be saved. She was too proud for that, or perhaps too honest. She only asked if it was not too much trouble that whoever was listening would not let her die alone. That was all. That someone someday would know where she had gone. Not for her sake. For the sake of the small silver locket, which had already been passed once from a mother to a daughter she did not know, and which deserved, she thought, to end its journey somewhere other than the bottom of a drift. She was thinking this, thinking it in the wordless way a person thinks when the cold has begun to take the edges off her mind when she saw the line. She almost missed it. She was watching the ground as she had told herself to do, and the line was above the ground. It was above her head, in fact, at the height of a low roof running level for perhaps 8 feet before it stopped. A straight line, perfectly horizontal. In a landscape where nothing was horizontal, where every branch bent and every drift curved and every tree leaned to the weight of its own snow, this one line was flat, man-made flat. She stopped. She stared. She wiped her lashes clear with the back of her wrist she could no longer feel. The line was still there. She took a step toward it, then another. The shape resolved itself out of the white with a slowness that felt almost cruel. A corner, an eave, the suggestion of a wall. Not a large wall, a short one, squat, low to the ground, wrapped in old moss and older snow so that it had made itself over years into a part of the mountain, and the mountain had allowed it. The eave was heavy with drift. Beneath the eave, a wooden door gray with weather hinged in iron, its handle a simple black bar. She did not permit herself to hope yet. She had heard in the mining camps of men so far gone with cold that they had seen towns where no towns were. She had heard of a prospector on the Blackfoot who had walked 3 miles across an open flat toward the lights of a saloon that no one else could see, and had been found the next morning face down in a coulee with a smile still on his mouth. She would not be that prospector. She reached out. She placed her palm flat against the wall. The wall was solid. She almost laughed. She did not, because her face would not permit it, but the sound tried to come up out of her chest, and it caught somewhere in her throat, and it turned instead into a small, hard sob that surprised her more than the wall had. She moved along the wall toward the door. Her mitten fumbled at the bar. The iron was so cold it seemed to burn through the wool. She lifted. The latch gave. The door groaned inward on hinges that had been recently oiled, she noted, though she was too far gone to make anything of the observation, and she half fell, half stepped across the threshold, and she pulled the door shut behind her with the last of the strength that was in her arm. The wind stopped. That was the first thing. The wind, which had been in her ears for so long that she had forgotten what its absence sounded like, simply stopped. The howl of it continued outside, muffled through the timbers, to a low, steady moan. But inside the small space where she now stood, the air was still. The stillness was so sudden that she swayed on her feet. The second thing was the smell. Old wood, old iron, the faint, dry ghost of smoke gone cold in a chimney. Beneath these, something else, a scent she had known in the sisters' laundry room at St. Bridget's when they had folded away the winter linens for spring, a scent of resin and thyme and things kept careful. It was the smell of a place that had been left but had not been abandoned. There was a difference. Della, standing in her wet coat with her mittens dripping onto the pine floor, understood the difference at once, though she could not yet have said how. Her eyes adjusted by degrees. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 14, and narrower at one end than at the other. That was the first strange thing. The walls were not square. They curved outward slightly from the roof, down the way the walls of a wagon box curve, and along the far wall she could see, when she looked closely, the outline of an old iron strap running vertically from floor to ceiling. A wagon strap. She stared at it for a long moment before she understood. She was standing inside a wagon, not a wagon alone, of course. Someone had built a house around it. Someone had at some point in a past she could not yet guess had driven a heavy freight wagon of the old covered kind, the sort with the high curved bed used by families on the western roads, into this small hollow of the ridge, and had stopped and had never left. They had taken down the canvas top. They had built a low-pitched roof of split shakes above the wagon bed. They had extended the floor forward with planks, and they had raised walls around the wagon body, and the wagon body itself had become the back half of the room where she now stood. The strap along the wall was one of the original iron braces of the wagon. The curve of the low ceiling above the back bunk was the curve of the wagon's own frame. Della lowered herself onto the small bench that ran along the near wall. She did it because her legs would no longer hold her. She sat with her hands in her lap and her wet coat steaming faintly in the trapped air. And she looked at the wagon that was a house, and she began for the first time since she had left Silverbow that morning to cry. It was not the sort of crying she was familiar with. It made no sound. The tears simply came, and she let them come because her hands were too cold to lift to her face, and because there was no one to see, and because she was against all reasonable expectation alive. When she could see again, she looked around her more carefully. At the center of the room, on a flat stone hearth set into the pine floor, stood a small cast-iron stove. It was not a mining camp stove of the modern kind. It was older. She recognized the boxy shape and the little decorative fluting along its base as the pattern the old Franklin foundries had made before the war. The stovepipe rose straight through the ceiling, boxed in a tin sleeve where it passed the shakes. Beside the stove, in a wooden crib, lay a small, careful stack of dry wood, perhaps a dozen split lengths of spruce, no more, but split recently, the wounds of the axe still pale on the exposed faces. Someone had left wood. Someone had left wood in this cabin in this season, and someone had oiled the door hinges, and someone had brushed the ashes clear from the hearthstone. She thought again of the mining camps. She thought of the men who had spoken of towns that were not there. Then she reached out and pressed her palm against the iron of the stove. The iron was cold, real cold. Cold in the way that only real iron is cold. Cold that pulled the last of the warmth out of her hand and gave her back nothing but the honest confirmation of its own solidity. This was not a town of the mind. This was a stove in a wagon in a cabin on a mountain, and she was inside it and she was alive. She fumbled her satchel open. Her fingers had gone stupid, and she had to work at the buckle for a long moment before it gave. The tin of matches was still dry inside its oilskin. She thanked the farrier in Kansas, whose name she had forgotten silently, for the folding knife with which she now shaved a curl of pine from one of the split lengths, and she thanked the army surgeon who had crossed the Bighorn silently for the paragraph about tinder that she had read in his account 4 winters back. She built the small, careful pyramid the way he had described. She struck the first match. The flame guttered in a draft she had not yet located and died before it could catch. She struck the second. Same. She sat back on her heels. She looked up. That was when she saw the writing. It had been cut into the wood above the stove in the thick pine of the header beam that framed the stovepipe. The letters were not fancy. They were the letters of a man who had held a knife for a long time in his life and had never once held a pen. They said, "Open the lower draft in a storm." Below them, "Dry spruce catches quickest." Below that, in a slightly smaller hand, as though the writer had run out of room and was making the best of what remained, "If smoke comes back, check the east flue." Della looked at the words for a long time. The wind moaned in the eaves above her. Her breath, when it came, went out in a thin white cloud that hung a moment in the cold air and then was gone. Whoever had cut those words had not cut them for himself. He had known where his own draft was. He had known which wood caught quickest. He had cut them for the next person. He had cut them for a stranger he would never meet in a season he would never see, and he had left the words there, in the pine, in the trust that on some far night, in some far storm, another set of frozen hands would find them and would live because of them. Her hands were the hands. She was the stranger. She reached beneath the stove and found the small iron lever of the lower draft. She opened it. She struck the third match. She held it to the base of the pine curl, and the pine caught, and the shaving above it caught, and the small split length above the shaving began at first shyly, then with growing conviction to burn. The flame climbed, the smoke rose. For a terrible half-breath, the smoke hung in the top of the stove and refused to go higher, and Della felt her whole chest tighten around a fear she did not have the strength to name. And then the draft caught the way a sail catches when a boat comes around into a following wind, and the smoke went up the pipe in a clean gray column, and the cabin exhaled, and she exhaled with it. She sat on the pine floor beside the stove with her back against the bench, and her hands held out to the growing heat, and she did not move for a long time. The warmth came into her fingers first in the burning ache that meant they were coming back. It came into her cheeks. It came into the bones behind her eyes, and it made her aware for the first time since she had crossed the threshold of how completely she had been ready to die. She had been ready. That was the truth she had not admitted. She had walked up the ridge that morning with a plan that was too thin in weather, that was too near on a mule that was too old, and beneath the plan in the weather, and the mule had been something she had not permitted herself to look at, a quiet, tired willingness to see what would happen if she stopped. Not a wish to die. She was too stubborn for that. Only a tiredness so old it had begun to feel like her own face in the mirror. Someone had known, not for her, not by name, yet someone had known decades before she was born that a stranger might one day stand exactly where she now stood, cold to the bone out of matches and out of luck. And someone had cut 3 sentences into a pine beam so that the stranger would live. It was the most personal thing that had ever been done for her. It had been done by a man who had never heard her name. She turned her head. The firelight had crept across the small room now, and the shadows had begun to gather in the far corners. She could see the bunk built into the curve of the old wagon frame, and the folded gray blanket at its foot, and the small shelf above it with what looked like a tin cup in a wooden bowl set neatly, as though the family who had lived here had only just stepped out and would soon step back in. She could see a second shelf near the door with an axe head hung by its blade in a leather loop waiting for a haft. She could see on the wall above the bench where she now sat a row of pegs, and on the pegs a smaller row of hooks, and on one of the hooks, dark with age, a leather bridle strap coiled around itself like something asleep. And then she saw that the bench beneath her was not solid. She had shifted her weight only slightly to reach a piece of wood, and beneath her hip, the plank had given a small distinct answering sound. It was not the creak of a plank flexing. It was the hollow sound a plank makes when there is empty space beneath it. She went still. She listened to the fire. She listened to the wind still moaning outside, held at bay now by the cabin, the way an old dog holds off a coyote from the door of a barn. Then slowly, deliberately, she slid herself off the bench and knelt on the floor and ran her fingers along the underside of the plank. 2/3 of the way toward the wall, her fingertips found a notch, a shallow one, cut into the underside of the wood in a shape her hand recognized before her mind did a small crescent size to a woman's fingertip worn smooth by use. She hooked her finger into the notch. She pulled. The plank came up. Beneath it, in a shallow well lined with strips of cedar, lay a bundle. It was wrapped in oiled cloth, and the oiled cloth was wrapped in a second layer of what looked like waxed muslin, and the whole was bound with a length of twine so old that the twine itself had darkened to the color of the wood around it. The bundle was flat, no thicker than a folded newspaper, roughly the size of a family Bible. It had been placed here on purpose. It had been wrapped by hands that had wanted it to keep. Della lifted it out. It weighed almost nothing. She held it a moment in both hands, kneeling on the pine floor with the fire at her back and the storm at the walls, and she felt very distinctly the small hair at the base of her neck stand up. She was not frightened. It was not that. It was the feeling a person has when she is about to open a door in her own house that she has never opened before, and she knows before she opens it that on the other side is a room she has been living beside her whole life without knowing it was there. She set the bundle in her lap. She did not untie it. Not yet. She looked at it, and she looked at the words above the stove, and she looked at the small, careful stack of split spruce that a stranger had left for another stranger, and she understood in a quiet corner of her mind that had not spoken up in many years that whatever was inside the oiled cloth had not been hidden. It had been kept. Someone had kept it in this bench, in this cabin, on this mountain for a very long time, and they had kept it in the trust that it would one day be found by someone whose need for it was greater than the finder yet knew. Outside on Copper Ridge, the wind rose one more notch, and the timbers of the old wagon cabin creaked once in reply, the way an old ship creaks against its mooring in a rising tide. Della Whitmore, 21 years old today, orphan of St. Louis. Laundress of Silverbow Crossing, sat with her hands on the bundle and her fire behind her, and her whole life on the far side of a door she was about to open, and she took a slow, careful breath, and she reached for the twine. The twine gave more easily than she had expected. It parted at the first tug as though it had been waiting 3 decades for a hand willing to ask, and the oiled cloth fell open across her lap in slow, reluctant folds that smelled faintly of tallow and cedar shavings. Beneath the outer wrap lay the waxed muslin, and beneath the muslin lay the letters, a thick block of them, edges soft with time, tied crosswise with a second length of finer twine that had been dyed once a pale blue. That blue had faded almost to gray, but not quite. Some care had gone into the choosing of it. Some woman standing at a dry goods counter in a town Della would never see had chosen blue over brown, had paid an extra coin for it, had brought it home in her apron pocket for the sake of the small dignity it would give to the paper she meant to bind. Della lifted the topmost sheet. The paper was heavier than modern paper, laid rather than woven, and the ink upon it had gone from black to a rich deep brown that pooled a little where the pen had lingered. She held it toward the fire. She read the salutation at the top, written in a hand that was strong at the downstrokes and hesitant at the loops. The hand of a man who had learned to write later in life than most. This being the journal of the family, Halloran commenced this 3rd day of November in the year of our Lord 1852. Upon the western slope of the ridge, our Josephine has named for the color of the copper vein below. She lowered the sheet into her lap. She looked up at the pine header above the stove where the 3 carved instructions kept their patient watch. Halloran. The name went into her the way a stone goes into still water, slow at first, then spreading. She had known there had been a family. The bench, the bunk, the shelf with the tin cup, all of it had spoken of a family before she had opened the twine. Yet the naming of them made them real in a way the objects alone had not. Thomas Halloran, whose knife had cut the letters above the stove. Josephine Halloran, 21 years old in some winter, 32 years gone, who had named a ridge for the color of a vein. A mother whose name was not yet given, but who had chosen a pale blue twine over brown. Della held the paper very still, as though a sudden movement might disturb them, might send them back to wherever they had been while she was still a stranger on their threshold. She read on. The journal was not a diary of days. It was a ledger of a life, the way a family that had come across the Oregon Trail with a broken axle and a decision to make would keep a life. Thomas had come out from a small county in the eastern part of Pennsylvania, west of Lancaster, where a hailstorm in the summer of 1850 had laid down his father's wheat crop in a single afternoon and taken the family's savings with it. Eliza, his wife, had grown up on a homestead outside Zanesville in Ohio, and she had known enough of hard weather and of tinctures and of the setting of small bones to be worth, as Thomas noted with the wry pride of a farmer, appraising his own team more than any 2 men on the wagon train they had joined out of Independence in the spring of '51. There were 3 children mentioned by name in the opening pages. Josephine, the eldest, 20 at the time of departure. Finn, a boy of 9, quick with sums, slow to trust. Maisie, a girl of 5 who cried at the sight of oxen and laughed at the sound of thunder. Della paused over Maisie's name. She had not expected to feel anything at reading of a child she would never meet. Yet the small unbidden picture came to her all the same. A fair-haired child of 5, in the bed of a covered wagon somewhere on the Sweetwater, laughing at a summer storm while her mother, worn from 1,000 miles, laid a hand on her forehead and pretended for her sake to laugh with her. Della folded the sheet with a care she had not folded anything in years. She set it aside. She reached for the next. The story unfolded in pieces. It was not written for a reader. It was written for the family themselves in the way of people who have no other library and know that a page is the only place where a season can be kept for later. In August of '52, the wagon had lost its rear axle on a stony run of trail just west of the divide, at a place the guide had called Copper Ridge on account of the low green stripe in the exposed rock. There had been no wheelwright within a week's travel. The main train had voted to press on before the passes filled, and the Hallorans had voted alone to stay. Thomas had built a shelter around the broken wagon because he did not trust the canvas top against a bitterroot winter. He had cut spruce and split shakes and board by board. Over 4 weeks of shortening days had made of the wagon bed, the back wall of a room of the arched wagon frame, the ceiling of a bunk of the tailgate, a bench that could be sat upon in the day and slept beside at night. He had scavenged a small foundry stove from a mining camp 30 miles south, hauling it up the ridge in two pieces on the back of the ox that had survived the crossing. Eliza had chinked the walls with moss and lime. Josephine had rendered tallow into candles in a pot, borrowed from the guide's abandoned supplies. Finn had gathered wood. Maisie had held the door open when hands were full, which was at 5 years old the greatest office of the household. Della read for perhaps an hour. The fire in the small stove settled into its steady work, and the trapped air of the cabin warmed to a temperature that made her aware at last of her own soaked stockings and the wet hem of her dress. She peeled the stockings off. She hung them from the peg above the bench where the bridle strap slept. She draped the coat across the bunk. The cabin, warmed and lit, seemed to shrink around her in the friendliest way, no longer a shelter she had stumbled into by luck, but a room she had been offered by hands long absent. She reached for another sheet and another, and she let the family speak. And by the time the light outside the small greased paper window had gone from the pale gray of storm to the darker gray of storm, and dust together, she knew Eliza's remedies for a chest cold, and Thomas's method for sharpening an axe on a river stone, and Finn's stubborn refusal to eat oats without a spoonful of the summer's dried huckleberries stirred in. She knew Josephine best of all. Josephine wrote too in a second hand that appeared in the middle third of the bundle, smaller than her father's, more decorated at the tails of the letters, the hand of a young woman who had once been a schoolgirl and had not entirely given up the pride of it. Her entries were not about weather or supplies. Her entries were about what she saw. A hawk that had spent the whole of a September afternoon riding a single thermal above the ridge, never once flapping. A pattern of frost on the greased paper of the window that had one January morning made a shape she was sure was the profile of her grandfather. A wolf she had watched at the tree line, at a distance of perhaps 40 yards, that had watched her back with what she called, in her own words, no more hostility than a stranger passing on a road. Josephine did not want to be at Copper Ridge. She was clear about that. She missed the streets of the town in Massachusetts where her mother's people still lived. The harbor smell, the sound of a Sunday bell that meant a church rather than a mining shift. She had come west because her father had come west, because her mother had come, because her siblings needed a big sister on a long road. She was clear about that too. She was also clear that she meant when the winter broke to teach. She had already worked out in the margin of one page the alphabet in letters larger than her ordinary hand, as though she had been practicing to write them on a slate for eyes younger than her own. Della ran her finger along the shape of the capital A, and she felt without warning a small warm ache in the base of her throat. She kept reading. She had come to the fourth or fifth sheet from the bottom of the stack when the date at the top of a page caught her and held her in a way none of the other dates had. She stared at it for a long moment before her mind consented to see it. October the 14th, 1852. She read on. Our Josephine is 21 today. There was little to give. The flour barrel is down to the last 2 cups, and we have kept those against the possibility of true necessity. Eliza has been saving a small quantity of sugar in a tin at the back of the shelf against this day since August. She turned it out this morning into what she called, without any pretense, the smallest cake in the West. She used the last of the tallow for the greasing of the pan. She used 2 of the eggs that Finn brought up yesterday from the coop we have contrived from an old barrel. She put the whole into the stove and did not open the door for 3/4 of an hour, and when she took it out, the top had risen no more than an inch, but it had risen. Josephine came in from the woodpile with her cheeks red as apples and stopped in the doorway and did not speak. Eliza set the little cake in the middle of the table on the china saucer she has carried since independence. Maisie sang the song her mother sang to her, which is not a birthday song, but the only song we had. Finn had made a card of birch bark with a hawk drawn upon it in charcoal, in honor of the one Josephine watched all afternoon in September. When we had finished, Josephine sat with her hands in her lap for a long moment. She said at last that in Boston, in the parlor of her aunt's house, she had once been given a birthday feast of oysters and a cake with icing 3 inches thick, and that she remembered nothing of that day now but the color of a curtain. She said this had been the finest birthday she had ever known. She said it in the tone of a person who was not being kind. She meant it. Her mother wept, but only when Josephine had gone out to bring in the evening wood. Della lowered the page slowly onto her lap. She did not weep at first. What she felt was closer to the small, quiet astonishment a person feels when she looks down at her own hand and understands for the first time in her life that a hand is a strange and marvelous object. October the 14th, 21 years old. A cake made from the last of the sugar because a mother had planned 2 months in advance for a daughter's birthday. That was the part that would not sit still in her chest. 2 months in advance. A woman in a wagon cabin on a mountain with a flour barrel down to 2 cups had begun in August to hide a spoonful at a time of sugar in a tin so that in October, when her eldest daughter turned 21, there would be a cake. Not because it was necessary, not because there was any prospect of any other soul remarking upon the date, because Josephine was hers and Josephine was 21, and the world would know, if only within the walls of this small curved room, that Josephine's coming into it had been a thing worth marking. Della had known that morning, standing at the window of Hollis' house, that no one in Silverbow would remark upon her own 21st. She had known it as she had known the temperature of the water in the wash kettle, as a matter of fact, without wound, because to feel it as a wound was to give it more of her than she could afford. Now in the pine-scented dark of a cabin 32 winters gone, a wound she had learned as a child to walk around opened cleanly beneath her hand, and she found that she had no answer for it except to sit still. It was not that Eliza Halloran had loved her daughter and no one had loved Della. She had made her peace with that arithmetic long ago. It was that Eliza Halloran had loved her daughter in a way that had left a residue in the world, a tin of hoarded sugar. A china saucer carried 1,000 miles of page in ink kept in oiled cloth beneath a bench, and that residue had lasted long enough to reach across 3 decades of storms and to speak on this one night to a stranger who had no such residue of her own. That was the thing. Della had not been unloved so much as unrecorded. There was no page anywhere in the world upon which any hand had written down in ink meant to last that, on the 14th day of February in the year 1863, a small red-faced infant had come into the world and had been named Adelaide. The tears came then. She did not fight them. She let them fall on the back of her wrist, where they made small dark circles on the wool of her cuff, and she let the fire crack in the stove, and she let the wind pull at the eaves outside, and she thought with the strange clarity that sometimes comes at such moments that a person could live her whole life without ever being seen and still on a single night be seen by someone she would never meet. That too was a form of witness. It was perhaps the oldest form. She sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. She did not read further that night. It seemed to her that to read further would be to press past a moment that deserved to be sat with. She folded the page. She placed it carefully back among its sisters. She rewrapped the bundle in the waxed muslin and the oiled cloth, though she did not retie the blue twine because it seemed to her that the twine had earned its retirement. She slid the bundle back into the well beneath the bench, and she laid the plank across it, and she rose to feed the fire. She slept that night on the pine floor beside the stove, wrapped in the gray blanket from the bunk, with her satchel for a pillow and the silver locket in her closed fist. She dreamed of a woman she did not know who was standing at a shelf and lifting down a tin and turning to smile at her as though at the answer to a long-asked question. She woke to a stillness so complete that at first she thought she had gone deaf. The storm was over. That was the first thing she understood. The moan that had been in the eaves through the whole of the previous day had gone, and in its place lay the particular silence of a mountain after a heavy snow, a silence with weight, a silence that pressed down upon the roof and upon the ears of anyone beneath it. The light through the greased paper of this window was pale, and even the sourceless morning light of an overcast sky above fresh drifts. She sat up. The fire in the stove had burned down to a bed of glowing coals under a soft crown of ash. She fed it a length of spruce, coaxed the flame back, and set the tin cup from the shelf onto the top plate to melt a handful of snow she scraped from the sill through the cracked door. She meant to leave that morning. She had planned it in her mind as she drifted off down the ridge, follow the drainage until it met the wagon road walk into Silverbow. Gather her wits, take stock, and then think again about the Ashby place. What she had not planned for was the man who was standing outside her door. She heard him before she saw him. Not a footfall, the snow was too deep for footfalls to carry, but the small, dry click of a rifle hammer being let down carefully to half-cock. It was a sound she had heard often enough in 3 years at a mining camp boarding house to know exactly what it was and to know exactly what its ordinary meaning was, that the man on the far side of the door had decided upon a moment's reflection that whatever was inside was not after all a bear. She stood up slowly. She looked at the folding knife on the bench, and she decided against it. A knife against a rifle was theater, not defense. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders. Then she stepped to the door, lifted the latch, and opened it. The man on the threshold was old. That was her first thought. He was old in the way certain men of the mountains grew old, lean rather than shrunken, weathered rather than worn, a beard grown out to the middle of his chest and gone the color of river stones. He wore a long coat of buckskin, blackened at the cuffs by decades of campfire smoke, and beneath the coat, a red flannel shirt washed nearly to pink by the same decades of hard water. Snowshoes were strapped to his back. A rifle, a heavy single-shot piece with a long octagonal barrel, hung in the crook of his left arm. The hammer down the muzzle pointed at the ground beside his boot. His eyes were pale gray and did not blink. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them moved. "I did not think I would find company today." His voice was low, roughened by cold air and by long silence between sentences. He spoke it the way a person speaks who is out of the habit of speaking. He did not smile. He did not scowl. He looked at her the way a man looks at a track in fresh snow when he is trying to decide what made it. "You are welcome to the fire. I am welcome to hope you have not burnt the place down." "I have not." "So I see." He glanced past her shoulder into the small, warm room, and something in his face eased by a fraction. He looked back at her. "May I come in? It's not my cabin." That for the first time drew from him something like a smile. It was a small smile, and it appeared only at one corner of his mouth, and it was gone almost before she was sure she had seen it. "It's not mine either, so I reckon we're equal in the matter." She stepped back from the doorway. He came in. He was taller than she had guessed at the door, and he had to duck the low header. He set the rifle carefully in the corner where the axe head hung on its leather loop, and he unslung his snowshoes and leaned them beside the rifle, and he shook the snow from the shoulders of his coat before he took the coat off all, with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had spent 40 winters in country where a wet coat left on a chair too long could kill you. Then he sat down on the bench where Della had sat the night before, and he held his hands out to the stove, and for perhaps a full minute he said nothing at all. Merrick, his gaze on the fire. "Silas Merrick, out of the Upper Blackfoot. I keep a cabin about 8 miles north of this ridge on the far side of the saddle. Adelaide Whitmore, out of Silverbow Crossing." He nodded once as though the name were a piece of information he had asked for and would file away. He glanced up at the header above the stove at the 3 carved instructions, and something moved behind his pale eyes that she could not read. When he looked back at her, his voice had a different quality, quieter, older, as though he had passed a threshold within himself and was speaking now from a room further in. "You are the second person I have known of to shelter here. The first was my grandfather in the fall of '68. He came off the north face in weather not much better than yesterday. He was of a mind to lie down under a spruce and be done with it. I was persuaded otherwise by finding a door where he had not expected one." She sat down on the edge of the bunk. She kept her hands folded in her lap. "Your grandfather, Ezra Merrick, trapper out of the Yellowstone country, and before that a wagon guide out of St. Joseph. He was 62 when this cabin caught him. He came back down to our winter camp near a week later with his fingers still black at the tips, and a story that he did not tell often because he was not a man for stories. But he told it once to my father, and my father told it to me when I was a boy of 9, on a night we were snowed in and out of whiskey and had nothing else to spend." "Did he know who built the cabin?" Silas shook his head once slowly. "He did not. There were letters here even then, but he did not read letters. He said only that he found the door oiled and the wood stacked, which is what he in his turn did before he left, and what my father did each year of his life, and what I have done each year of mine. It is a small enough tribute for a place that saves a life." Della looked at the small, careful stack of split spruce in the crib beside the stove. She looked at the door hinges which had swung so smoothly for her the day before. She had wondered at both briefly, and then she had let the wondering go because the fire had been the more pressing matter. Now the wondering came back, and with it a piece of the puzzle she had not known was missing. There had been footprints in some unspoken corner of her mind, the fact that the cabin had felt too kept for a place forgotten by the world. Someone had been keeping it. 3 generations of someones had been keeping it, not out of ownership, out of debt. Ezra Merrick had walked out of the storm of '68 owing something he could not pay, and his son and his grandson had made the payments in his stead. One oil can at a time, one armload of split spruce at a time for 16 years. That is why the wood was dry. Her voice was low. She was working it out aloud more for herself than for him. It is why. And the door. Yes. And you have never told anyone this cabin is here. He was quiet a long moment. He watched the fire. When he spoke, it was without any pride, without any performance, only the flat, plain honesty of a man reporting a fact he had lived with for a long time. My grandfather asked my father not to. My father asked me the same. It was his notion that a cabin that saves strangers ought to be left where strangers who need it can find it, and not where strangers who don't will come looking. He was not a lettered man, but he had thought about it, and I have not in all these years found a better thought. She looked around the small warm room, the bench she sat upon, the bunk, the pine header above the stove with its 3 unshowy sentences. Someone she would never meet had cut those letters for her benefit. Someone else she would never meet and could not now meet had oiled the hinges for her benefit. Somewhere in the timber this morning an old man had strapped snowshoes to his back and had come up the ridge to check the flue and the stack and the latch, and had found instead a young woman he had not expected, and had chosen to knock rather than to turn away. The world had been more crowded than she had known. There was a family, she said. The people who built it. Their name was Halloran. Silas looked at her sharply for the first time. Then his face softened again. I did not know the name. Josephine, Thomas, Eliza, 2 little ones, Finn and Maisie. They came off the Oregon Trail in '52, broke down here, wintered over, and by the following spring, the father wrote in one of the last pages of the journal that they meant to go on to Fort Owen, and from there down toward the Willamette. There is no page after that in the bundle, so I do not know what became of them. Something passed across the old man's face. It was not surprise. It was more like the small settling of a piece that has been slightly out of place for a long time. He turned his hands in the firelight, palm up, palm down, as though examining evidence. Fort Owen. That is a name I have heard. There was talk when I was a boy up along the Blackfoot of a Wagon family that had wintered somewhere in the Bitterroots and had come out, come spring, and had gone on to Oregon and prospered. I did not know it was this family. It might not have been. That country was full of wagons then. But it might have been. Della had not known until he said it how much she wanted it to have been. They spoke for another hour or a little more. Silas ate a piece of the bread she offered him from her satchel, and she drank a cup of tea he brewed from a twist of dried leaves he produced from a pouch at his belt. Something bitter and clean that he said was for the lungs against the cold. He did not tell her his life. She did not ask him to. There were only sparse sentences here and there that added themselves to the small picture of him as they went, that he had ridden as a scout for the 2nd Cavalry out of Fort Ellis in the '60s, that he had come away from that service without any wish to speak of what he had seen, that his wife had died in '71 and his one son had died in '74, and he had gone up into the timber after that and had never come back down for longer than the buying of salt and coffee. He said these things the way a man might mention the weather. She understood that they were the shape of him, and she left them where he set them. When it came time to leave, he strapped his snowshoes back on and lent her a spare pair he had kept lashed inside his coat, smaller ones made for a boy, and he walked her down the ridge himself. I did not need to. She had said so, and he had ignored her saying it, and after the first mile she had stopped saying it and had accepted the escort in the spirit in which it was offered, which was the spirit of a man completing an unfinished sentence 16 years in the making. They crossed the drift country in silence. The clouds had begun to break by noon, and thin bars of pale October sun fell now and then across the fresh snow, lighting the tops of the spruce with a color that was almost gold. They came down out of the timber into the upper switchbacks of the wagon road above Silverbow at perhaps 3 in the afternoon. It was there at a broad bend where the road cut across a shoulder of open ground that they met the horses. There were 3 of them. The lead rider sat easy in the saddle of a tall bay mare, and even at 40 yards, Della recognized the cut of his coat before she recognized his face. Black broadcloth, in Silverbow, on a road that ran to no place a merchant needed to be. Cyrus Fenwick had come out of the town after her, and he had brought 2 men with him, and one of the 2 carried a rifle across the pommel of his saddle in a way that made a person aware that a rifle carried so was not carried for game. She stopped in the trail. Silas stopped beside her. His right hand did not move. It only shifted very slightly so that when it fell, it would fall against the walnut grip of the sharps at his hip. And Della felt without turning her head the exact moment at which the old scout's whole shape changed from a man walking a young woman down a mountain to a man weighing distances and angles. He did not speak. He did not need to. His stillness said all he intended to say. Fennec reined in the bay 10 yards short of them and touched the brim of his hat as though at a garden party. His smile was as pleasant as she remembered. "Miss Whitmore, what a fortunate thing. We were beginning to be concerned. There was no cause." "No, no, of course not." His eyes moved to Silas, took him in, catalogued the rifle and the beard and the buckskin, and moved back to her without dwelling. "Only when Mrs. Hollis found your note and your board money on the pillow, and when the hostler at the livery said you had gone up the miner's cut on old Barnaby, and when Barnaby came back into town yesterday morning without a rider, you can see how a natural anxiety would develop. I took the liberty of organizing a small party." She had not counted on the mule. She had not counted on the mule at all. Barnaby, honest, broken-legged old creature that he was, had somehow limped his way back down the ridge in the storm and had turned up at the livery door and had told in the mute language of an empty saddle exactly the tale that Cyrus Fenwick had needed him to tell. "I am much obliged for the concern, Mr. Fenwick." Her voice was level. She was working hard to keep it level. "As you see, I am well. I mean to walk on into town." Of course, of course." Fenwick did not dismount. He did not signal his men to dismount either. His eyes shifted briefly to a point behind her shoulder, up the ridge at the timberline, at the direction from which she had come. And something passed through his expression that she did not like at all. "May I ask where you sheltered?" "On the ridge." "Where on the ridge, Miss Whitmore?" Silas answered before she could. His voice was the same low, rough voice he had used at the cabin door that morning, but the softness that had come into it later when the fire had warmed him was not in it now. "The lady sheltered under a rock overhang below the crest. I came upon her at first light. I am walking her down to town." Fenwick studied Silas for a long moment. The two men behind him were watching Silas too. The one with the rifle across his pommel had let his right hand drop very casually toward the trigger guard. Silas had not moved at all. Della understood in a way she had not understood before, that a stillness could be a language, and that these four men were all speaking it fluently at each other across 10 yards of frozen road. "A rock overhang." Fenwick said it as though he were tasting it. "In such weather, that was a great fortune." It was. "There is a story running through the camps." Fenwick spoke it toward Silas, but his eyes had come back to Della. "Of a wintering cabin somewhere in these ridges from the old days. Built out of a wagon, they say. I have been trying to find someone who could point me toward it. I understand the ground it would be sitting on has never been filed on. Under the amendments of '81 to the Homestead Act, a structure without a recorded claimant can be entered upon by any citizen who improves it. It would be a considerable improvement for me if I could find such a place." Della did not answer. She did not trust her face. Silas answered again as evenly as before. "I have not heard of the like." "You have not?" "No." "That is strange, Mr. I did not catch your name, sir." "Merrick." "That is strange, Mr. Merrick, because I was told in the assay office not 2 hours ago that an old scout of that name out of the upper Blackfoot was known to run the country north of Copper Ridge better than any man alive." Silas did not flinch. He did not smile. He looked at Fenwick with the pale gray patience of a man who had in his 65 years been looked at by things a great deal more dangerous than a merchant on a bay mare. "I run country. I do not run cabins." There was a silence then that was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence in which men decide whether a next step will or will not be taken. Della understood standing between them that Fenwick was weighing the odds. The two men, the rifle, the walnut grip near Silas's hip, the young woman on foot, the open road, the town 4 miles below. She understood that Fenwick was a man who preferred to win his battles at desks. She saw him decide in the small pinching at the corner of his mouth that today was not a day for a battle. Today was a day for a warning. He touched his hat again. "Miss Whitmore, I look forward to seeing you again in town. You may, of course, consider yourself no longer in the employ of Mrs. Hollis. I have taken the liberty of settling your final account in gratitude for the trouble you have caused a great many people. I am sure that so resourceful a young woman will find another position." His smile did not reach his eyes. There is, I hear, some 4 weeks yet before the passes close. A great deal of business can be done in 4 weeks. I hope you will not spend the whole of it out of doors. He turned the bay. His 2 men turned their mounts with him. They rode past Della and Silas at a walk, not looking back, and the rifle across the second man's pommel remained where it had been, and Della did not breathe properly again until the sound of the hooves had faded around the bend below. Silas exhaled once slowly through his nose. He did not move his hand from where it rested near his hip until the last hoofbeat was gone. Then he looked at her, and for the first time that day there was something in his eyes that could almost have been called worry. He knows. He knows something, she said. He does not yet know the where of it. He will find it out. How? Any way he wants to. Money finds out most things. Silas glanced back up the ridge toward the timber. The pale October sun was slanting across the drifts now in long amber bars. 4 weeks he gave you. He did not give you 4 weeks out of charity. He gave you 4 weeks because that is how long it will take him to file the paper in Helena and come back with a deputy marshal and a burning brand. A place with letters in it is a place with proof of a prior claim. He will burn the letters first, then the cabin. Then the paper he files will read that he improved a piece of vacant ground, and the improvement will be a heap of ash. He will build his own shanty upon come spring. She had known it before he said it. She had known it in truth from the moment Fenwick had spoken the word improvement in the tone he had used. Hearing it aloud made it hers in a way it had not yet been. Somewhere in a metal box in the assay office at this very hour, Cyrus Fenwick was probably already sharpening his pen. Somewhere in a small cabin on Copper Ridge, a bundle of letters was still lying beneath a bench where a woman she had never known had once hidden it. And if Della Whitmore did nothing, that bundle would be a handful of ash before the first snow of December. She had spent the whole of her adult life keeping her head down. She had learned it as a child in the corridors of the orphan asylum, and she had polished the habit in every household she had passed through since. The world was hard on girls who raised their voices. The world was hardest of all on girls who raised their voices about things that were none of their business. This was not by any measure a court or a merchant or a preacher would recognize her business. She was not a Halloran. She was not kin. She had no legal standing on Copper Ridge, no ownership of anything but $18 in mixed coin and a silver locket engraved with letters that might or might not be her own initials. Yet somewhere in a small warm room the night before, a woman named Eliza had put her hoarded sugar into a pan for a daughter who had cried at oxen and had wept only after the daughter had gone out for the wood, and the record of that weeping had come into Della's hands as though placed there. Someone had to be the one who kept it kept. If not her, then no one, and no one had already been the answer for 32 years and was not, in her opinion, a sufficient answer any longer. I mean to save it, she said. Her voice sounded strange to her, calmer than she felt. The cabin, the letters, all of it. Silas looked at her a long moment. Then he inclined his head, the smallest of gestures, the way a man acknowledges a decision made by someone who has, by the making of it, earned a rank he had not yet held. How? I do not know yet. The Historical Society in Helena, perhaps. There is a chapter. I have read of it in the papers Mrs. Hollis kept in the parlor. They have petitioned for the preservation of old fur post ruins along the Marias. If they will petition for a fur post, they will petition for a wagon cabin. If I can put a paper in the hand of the right person in Helena before Fenwick puts his paper in the hand of the wrong one, we have a chance. 4 weeks. 4 weeks. You cannot ride to Helena in the season, girl. You would not make it past Deer Lodge before the pass is closed. Even the freight is coming north by way of Missoula now. She had thought of that already. She had thought of it as she watched Fenwick's back diminish down the road. Then I do not go to Helena. I go to Missoula. There is a garrison at Fort Missoula. There is a telegraph line from Missoula east to Helena that runs whether the passes are open or shut. If I can put my letter into the hand of an officer at Missoula who knows the society, my letter is in Helena in a day. Fenwick has to ride to Helena himself. It is his weakness. He is a merchant. He does not know soldiers. Silas looked at her again, and the smile came back to the corner of his mouth, and this time it stayed a moment longer than the first time. You have thought about this. I have been thinking about it since he said the word improvement. I know an officer at Missoula, Major Rensselaer. He served with me under Colonel Gibbon. He owes me nothing, and I owe him nothing. which between old men is the best foundation there is for the asking of a favor. I will take you as far as Missoula myself. From Silverbow it is 3 days if the weather holds, and 4 if it does not. Can you ride? I can if someone will lend me a horse. I have 2. They came down into Silverbow at dusk. The town had already lit its lamps, and the yellow squares of the saloon windows and the storefront windows lay in warm patches across the frozen mud of the street. Della felt walking past the assay office that Fennec was likely inside it at that very moment. She did not look. She went to the livery instead, and she thanked the hostler for his old mule, who was standing quietly in the third stall with a poultice on his foreknee, and she pressed one of her precious $18 into the hostler's palm and asked him to see to Barnaby's keep for the winter. And the hostler took the dollar and looked at her with a puzzled tenderness and did not ask her why. She did not sleep at Hollis' house that night. She could not. She went instead to the small parsonage behind the Methodist church at the north end of town, and she knocked at the door of Reverend Josiah Beale, whom she had known slightly for 2 years, by reason of having sometimes mended his wife's altar cloths, and she asked him for one night of shelter, and in the morning for a written character. He gave her both. He gave them without questions, on the strength of the altar cloths, and on the strength of her face, which he studied for a long moment, before he nodded and stepped back from the door. She slept in the small guest room off the pantry on a horsehair mattress that seemed to her that night the softest bed she had ever known. In the morning before first light, she and Silas Merrick rode west out of Silverbow Crossing on 2 great horses, out of his string with the character letter from Reverend Beale folded flat in the oilskin pouch beside the $18, and with a copy of the Halloran Journal's title page, which Della had spent an hour copying by candlelight the previous evening, on a sheet of the Reverend's own foolscap, in her most careful copper plate folded flat beneath the character letter. The wagon road ran west along the shoulder of the Bitterroots above the drainage of the Clark Fork, and by noon on the 3rd day they crossed the Hellgate River on the plank bridge above Missoula and rode up between the tall, pale sycamores of the Rattlesnake Bottoms toward the low white barracks of the fort. Major Ephraim Rensselaer met them in the fort adjutant's office at 4 in the afternoon. He was perhaps 60 gray at the temples, spare, with an old saber cut along the line of his jaw that he had grown a short beard to soften. He shook Silas's hand once hard, without smiling, in the manner of 2 men who had said everything they needed to say to each other 12 years ago. He listened to Della for a full quarter of an hour without interrupting. When she was finished, he asked her 3 questions, the exact wording of Fenwick's threat, the exact date on the topmost sheet of the Halloran Journal, and the exact miles from Silverbow to the cabin as best she could estimate them. She answered each. He nodded. Then he sat back in his chair, and he looked at her for a moment, as a man looks at a young horse he had not expected to like. And he said, "Miss Whitmore, I can put a telegram into the society office in Helena by nightfall. I cannot promise you the society will act. That is not in my gift." "I understand, sir." "You do not. You think you do. You have never asked a favor of a society of gentlemen. They will not act on a letter from a girl. They will not act on a telegram from a major of infantry. They will act, if they act at all, on a letter from another gentleman of standing." Her heart, which had ridden 3 days above her breastbone, and had come at last to rest upon reaching him, sank a full inch. "Then I have wasted your time and my own." "You have not. I did not say you had wasted anyone's time. I said that the letter must come from a gentleman of standing. I am not one. Silas here is not one. Reverend Beale of Silverbow. I regret to inform you is also not one in the eyes of Helena." The old officer allowed himself briefly the shadow of a smile. "You require, in short, an intercessor. And it happens, Miss Whitmore, that the wife of a gentleman of considerable standing in this territory is at present a guest at the Higgins Hotel 2 blocks south of this desk. She came up on the stage from Helena the day before yesterday on business of her late father's estate. She keeps a lively interest in the preservation of frontier antiquities. Her name is Mrs. Harriet Ashby." Della sat very still. The name rang once in her chest softly, like the striking of a small, clean bell. "Ashby," she said, "of the ranch above Silverbow." "The same. Her husband was of the 2nd Wisconsin at Antietam, and knew my father in the war, which is what I remember of the family, though I have not laid eyes on either of them in 10 years. She is, I am told, a formidable correspondent." Rensselaer folded his hands upon the desk. "I will write you a letter of introduction to her. What you do with it is not my affair. I would suggest you present yourself at the hotel by 7 this evening. She dines at 7. She does not, I am told, admit petitioners after 8. Della was on her feet without knowing she had risen. She was thanking him. He was waving off her thanks. Silas was watching her with something like the look a man wears when a horse he had bought cheap in the spring proves itself in the fall to have been worth twice what he paid. At 6 of the clock, she was on the boardwalk outside the Higgins Hotel. The lamps had been lit inside the dining room, and through the tall windows she could see a woman of about 60 at the small corner table alone with a book propped against her water glass. A woman with iron gray hair pinned high in a plain gray traveling dress, and the quiet, self-contained bearing of a person who had spent her life in the company of both Cattle and Emerson. Della stood on the boardwalk with the letter of introduction folded in her hand, and she watched Harriet Ashby turn a page, and she understood that everything she had come to save now rested upon whether a stranger in a hotel dining room would look up from a book and upon looking up would see her. She drew in one long breath of the cold Missoula air. She placed her hand on the door. Inside at the corner table, Harriet Ashby paused in her reading, glanced toward the front of the room, as though at some small change in the light, and raised her eyes. The dining room of the Higgins Hotel was warm in the way that public rooms in Western towns were warm overheated near the great cast-iron stove at the center, still cool along the outer walls, where the plate glass gave onto the street, and thick throughout with the mingled scent of roast beef, coffee, wood smoke, and the pomade that traveling drummers wore. A boy in a white apron was carrying a tray of bread rolls toward a table of railroad men near the front window. A pianist in the far corner was picking his way through a slow rendition of a parlor song with a broken third key. Della crossed the carpet with her boots feeling twice their weight and her heart doing something disorderly beneath her collar, and she stopped at a respectful distance from the corner table and she waited to be noticed. Harriet Ashby had already noticed her. She marked her place in the book with a slim ribbon, closed the volume, and set it aside without haste. Her eyes were the pale hazel of good river water in summer, and they took Della in at one thorough passage: the mended cuffs of the wool dress, the man's coat too large across the shoulders, the folded paper held carefully rather than clutched before she spoke. "You are the young woman Major Rensselaer sent." "Yes, ma'am." "He wrote a very short note. He is an economical man." The older woman gestured once to the chair across from her. "Sit, if you please. I have not yet had my supper. I do not care to have serious conversation while a plate is being set down between us. Are you hungry?" Della found she could not answer that question honestly without embarrassment. She had eaten a heel of bread on the road that afternoon and had not thought about food since. "You are hungry." Mrs. Ashby lifted one finger no more than an inch from the tablecloth. The boy in the white apron was at her elbow within 4 seconds. "2 of the beef. A pot of tea. Bring the tea first." She turned back to Della. "Now tell me your business in the order you would tell it to a woman who has heard a good many stories in her life and has learned to prefer the middle to the beginning." Della had prepared the beginning. She set it aside. She told the middle instead. She told the flour barrel at 2 cups and the sugar hoarded in a tin from August. She told the letters wrapped in oiled cloth beneath a bench. She told the 3 sentences carved into a pine header by a hand that had known the value of teaching a stranger to stay alive. She told the black broadcloth coat in the word improvement in the 4 weeks. She spoke for perhaps 15 minutes without pause, and Harriet Ashby did not interrupt her once, and when the tea came, the older woman poured for them both with the same economy of motion without taking her eyes from Della's face. When Della had finished, Mrs. Ashby did not immediately speak. She stirred her tea slowly with a small silver spoon. She looked out the plate glass window at the darkened street of Missoula, where a lamplighter was making his patient way from post to post. When she turned back, her expression was harder to read than it had been. "There was a name in your account. Say it again for me. The mother's name. The one who kept the sugar." "Eliza. Eliza Halloran." Mrs. Ashby set the silver spoon on the saucer with a small, distinct sound. She was quiet a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, drawn from a further room, the way Silas's had been at the cabin door when he had begun to speak of his grandfather. "My mother was born in the fall of 1853 at the settlement of Fort Owen in the Bitterroot Valley. My grandmother went into her labor a full month before her time, in a January that had not seen a break in the weather since Christmas. There was no post surgeon within 4 days' travel. The wife of the trader had never attended a birth. My grandmother was 39 years of age, and she had already lost 2 children before their first year, and she was, by her own account, which I heard from her own lips before she died, entirely reconciled to not surviving the night. Mrs. Ashby lifted her cup, drank once, set it down without ever quite looking at Della. A woman came in from a wagon party that had wintered somewhere in the ridges to the north. She was traveling south with her husband and her children in the direction of the Willamette, and she had stopped at Fort Owen for supplies. She heard of the situation from the trader's wife. She walked into my grandmother's room without asking permission. She stayed for 11 hours. She brought my mother into the world, and she brought my grandmother out of it alive, and she refused any payment beyond a pound of coffee and a spool of pale blue twine. Her name, my grandmother told me on the last afternoon of her life, was Eliza Halloran. Della had put her cup down at some point. She could not remember doing it. Pale blue twine, she said. She did not know why she said it first. Perhaps because it was the smallest of the details, and small details were the only things her mind could still hold. The bundle of letters. It was tied with a pale blue twine. Something moved behind the pale hazel eyes across the table. Mrs. Ashby did not weep. She was not a woman Della understood who wept in public rooms, but her mouth softened for a moment, and she reached across the tablecloth and laid her hand briefly upon Della's wrist. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I have owed a debt for 60 years that I did not know how to begin to pay. I begin to think you have brought me the means." The plates arrived. Della ate. She could not afterward have said what the beef had tasted like. Mrs. Ashby ate with her in a silence that was no longer the silence of strangers. And when the plates had been cleared and the tea refreshed, the older woman drew a small notebook from the pocket of her traveling dress and a silver pencil, and she began with the crisp economy of a woman who had run a cattle operation and 2 ranch households for the better part of 40 years to write out a list. She wrote a telegram to be dispatched that night to the president of the Montana Historical Society in Helena, over her own signature, with a request that its reply be sent care of the Higgins Hotel by first light. She wrote a second telegram to a lawyer in Deer Lodge, whose name Della did not recognize, requesting his immediate service in the matter of a filing at the land office in Helena. She wrote a letter to her husband at their ranch on the far side of Copper Ridge to be carried by the fastest rider the fort could spare, informing him of what she had learned and requesting that he present himself in Silverbow Crossing within the week with 3 ranch hands, 2 spare horses, and the deed box from his study. She wrote a 4th letter to a photographer in Helena, requesting his presence with plate and camera at Silverbow on a date to be confirmed. She wrote all 4 in less than an hour in a hand, as clean and level as engineer script, and when she was finished, she looked up at Della and said without any particular emphasis, "You will sleep here tonight. I have taken the room across the hall. In the morning we begin." The 4 weeks that followed were the longest of Della's life and the shortest. They ran together in a manner she was later unable when asked to disentangle. She rode back east with Harriet Ashby to Silverbow Crossing in a hired buckboard with Silas Merrick riding escort, and she slept 2 nights at the parsonage of Reverend Beale and a 3rd night at the ranch of Wendell Ashby himself at the head of the upper meadow above Copper Ridge. She met the master of that ranch on the 2nd afternoon of her stay there, when he came in from a long ride along the north fence with snow melting on the brim of his hat. Wendell Ashby was tall for a man of 68 spare, through the shoulders, gray at the temples, and gray at the beard, and he moved with the small, deliberate carefulness of a man who had been shot in the hip at Antietam and had never entirely stopped noticing it. He shook Della's hand once hard without ceremony. His eyes were the color of his wife's, though set deeper. "My wife tells me you have brought us the chance to settle a matter of long standing." His voice quiet. "I am obliged to you for the bringing of it. I mean to do what I can." He did more than what he could. He rode to Helena himself in the 2nd week over the passes that everyone had said would be closed on a strong young horse he had trained the summer before for exactly such contingencies. He came back 7 days later with 3 documents folded flat in his saddlebag, a provisional certificate of historical significance from the society signed by 3 of its officers, a stay of any homestead filing on the parcel in question granted by the Register of the Land Office pending investigation, and most quietly and most usefully of all, a letter from the territorial governor's own private secretary requesting that the county sheriff at Silverbow give any lawful assistance necessary to the party of examination that would ascend Copper Ridge in the 3rd week of November. The party of examination assembled at Silverbow on a Thursday morning. It comprised Wendell Ashby, his 3 most reliable hands, Silas Merrick, Reverend Beale as a witness of unimpeachable local standing, The county sheriff, a lean, humorless man named Coombs, who had received his letter from Helena with a small pinching of the mouth that spoke of long-held feelings about Mr. Fenwick, the photographer from Helena, with his cases, and Della in a new pair of proper winter boots that Harriet Ashby had ordered up from the dry goods on her own account, and had presented to Della with the flat statement that a person could not save a cabin in the boots she had ridden in on. Harriet herself did not come. She had a stronger judgment than her husband did about what she could and could not still do at 60 on a mountain in November, and she had decided to remain at Silverbow and to run the correspondence. They rode out at first light. It was cold enough that the mule's breath made small twin clouds at every step. The wagon road took them as far as the Miners' Cut, and from the Miners' Cut they went on foot, and by lead horse up the switchbacks Della had climbed alone 6 weeks before. She recognized nothing and everything. The aspens had lost the last of their gold. The spruce stood in their winter black. The trail had been recut in places by the freighters who had been running an extra sled up over the ridge to bring down cordwood, and the going was easier than it had any right to be at that season. They reached the small hollow of timber where the wagon cabin stood at 2:30 in the afternoon, and the sun through the high, thin clouds laid a pale gold light across the drift country. In one of Wendell Ashby's hands, a young man of perhaps 22, named Cody Renner, took off his hat when he saw the cabin, though no one had told him to. Fenwick was already there. He was standing in the small clearing outside the door with 2 of his men beside him, and a third holding a horse a short distance back. There was a can of coal oil at his feet. He had not yet opened it. He had, however, laid a small bundle of kindling against the near wall of the cabin, and he had positioned himself between the kindling and the arriving party in a way that made his intent perfectly clear without requiring him to speak it. He had seen them coming for perhaps 10 minutes. He had chosen to wait. He touched his hat to Della as she came into the clearing. His smile was the same pleasant smile she remembered from the doorway of room number 4 at Hollis House. "Miss Whitmore, what a considerable party. I confess I had not expected an escort of quite this size." Sheriff Coombs stepped forward before Wendell Ashby could speak. He was carrying folded flat in the breast of his coat the letter from the territorial governor's private secretary. He took it out. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Mr. Fenwick, this parcel is under stay of land office action pending investigation. You will step away from that wall. You will pick up that oil can. You will walk it back to your saddle. You will make no filing on this ground, and no other man in this territory will make one on your behalf. I will personally arrest any man who strikes a match within 100 yards of that door." Fenwick did not immediately move. His eyes went to the letter, then to Wendell Ashby, then to Silas Merrick, and lastly and longest to Della. Something passed across his face that had not been there in any of their previous meetings. It was not anger. Anger would have been a species of respect, and Cyrus Fenwick was not in that moment prepared to grant Della Whitmore any species of respect. What crossed his face was a small blank incomprehension, as though a piece of furniture he had used all his life had suddenly refused to be sat upon. He looked at her as if he could not quite believe that the girl from the linen basket was standing in the middle of a mountain clearing with a county sheriff in a territorial letter and the deeded owner of half the upper valley behind her, and that all of those men had come at her word. "Miss Whitmore," he said the name softly, "you have gone to a very great deal of trouble over a heap of old wood." She looked at him steadily. She was aware in some quiet part of herself that this was the first time in her life she had ever looked steadily at a man in a black broadcloth coat and found that the coat was smaller than the man wearing it. "It is not a heap of old wood, Mr. Fenwick," her voice level. "It is a house that has been keeping strangers alive for 32 years. It has kept me alive. It kept a man's grandfather alive in the winter of '68. It will keep others alive after I'm gone. You cannot burn a thing like that for a filing fee. I will not permit it. These men will not permit it. And you, in the end, are not the man you have been pretending to be. You are a merchant who saw an easy paper and mistook it for an easy conscience. Pick up your oil." He picked up his oil. He did it slowly. He did it with the small, ceremonious dignity of a man salvaging what he could of a scene he had already lost, and he walked it back to the horse the third man was holding, and he did not look at her again. His 2 hired men followed him. In 4 minutes, the 3 of them were mounted and gone through the timber toward the south, and the sound of their hooves faded into the mountain, the way an unwanted memory fades from a room after the door is closed on it. Sheriff Coombs folded the governor's letter back into his coat with the small satisfaction of a man who had spent 40 years in the peacekeeping trade and had not in the whole of it been given so pleasant a document to deliver. Wendell Ashby set his hand once briefly on Della's shoulder. Silas Merrick, who had said nothing during the whole encounter, walked past all of them to the door of the cabin, and he opened it, and he looked in, and he stepped back so that Della might enter first. Della understood the courtesy for what it was. She stepped across the threshold into the small, warm dark of the cabin, and for a moment she stood alone in it, and she felt without any dramatic tightening in her chest, only a small, clean settling of a matter that had been unsettled since the morning of her 21st birthday. The photographer took his plates. He set his tripod inside the door for a wide view of the room, and outside for a view of the eave and the door, and the low-pitched roof, and he made Della stand once awkwardly beside the pine header above the stove, so that the 3 carved instructions would appear over her shoulder in what he called, with the pride of his trade, the composition of the age. The sheriff wrote out an inventory of what the cabin contained in a small notebook, and Wendell Ashby countersigned each page. Silas Merrick unstrapped a small crate from one of the pack mules the crate had ridden up in silence, no one commenting on it, and inside the crate was a second box of oiled cedar empty, lined with waxed muslin. Della understood without being told that this was the box that would carry the letters down off the mountain. She lifted the bench plank. She raised the bundle. She placed it without unwrapping into the cedar box. The blue twine she left where it was. It was Cody Renner, the young hand, who found the second cache. He had been sent to check the flue with a lantern and a coil of wire on the theory that a stack that had been minded for 16 years by an old scout in his 60s ought to be minded now by younger hands out of proper respect. He came down from the roof with his forearms sooted and his hat crooked, and he stopped in the middle of the cabin and looked at the floor near the stove hearth, and he said in the flat, surprised tone of a man who had not expected to say anything at all, "There's a plank loose here, too." There was. It ran along the base of the stone hearth, sized to a hand, and worn smooth in the same small crescent notch that Della had found beneath the bench. Silas knelt with the lantern. Wendell Ashby knelt beside him. Della watched from 3 feet back with her hands folded together in front of her because she did not entirely trust them to hold still. The plank came up. The well beneath it was deeper than the first cut into the packed earth beneath the hearthstone, lined with cedar strips and holding a single object rather than a bundle. A metal box the size of a small strongbox tin, plated over iron, with a hinged lid and a simple iron hasp. The hasp was not locked. Silas lifted the box out onto the floorboards. He set it down without opening it. He looked up at Della. "Miss Whitmore, it ought to be your hand." She knelt on the boards beside him. She lifted the lid. Inside, laid in layers of the same waxed muslin that had wrapped the letters, was a life. On the top layer, a family Bible, leather-bound the size of a folded newspaper, the spine crazed with age but the boards still sound. She lifted the cover. The frontispiece bore in the same strong hand that had written the journal's title, "A Family Register, Thomas Halloran and Eliza Halloran, married in the parish of St. James in the county of York, Pennsylvania, on the 7th day of April, 1830. Beneath their names, 3 lines. Josephine Halloran, born the 14th of October, 1831, Boston, Massachusetts. Finn Halloran, born the 2nd of March, 1843. Maisie Halloran, born the 9th of June, 1847. Below those, in Eliza's smaller hand, 3 later entries recording the removal of the family to Fort Owen in the spring of 1853, the removal of the family to Salem in the territory of Oregon in the fall of the same year, and in a hand Della did not know. Careful feminine dated many years later, the sad plain notice of Thomas Halloran's death in Salem on the 11th of January, 1871. Beneath the Bible, wrapped in its own square of muslin, an object that gleamed dully in the lantern light, a pocket watch of yellow brass on a short brass chain, its glass cracked in a single fine line from the winding stem to the numeral 6. Its hand stopped at 20 minutes past 4. Beneath that, in a small envelope of oiled paper, 4 silver dollars and a scattering of half-dimes. Beneath that, a daguerreotype in a case of stamped leather, the case's small brass clasp still working the plate within, showing a family group in the stiff, formal pose of the late 40s, a broad-shouldered man with a strong jaw and slightly bewildered eyes, a slim, serious woman in a dark dress with a lace collar, a young woman of perhaps 18 with her mother's mouth and her father's brow, a small boy in short pants clutching a wooden hoop, and seated on her mother's lap, a very small girl with fair curls whose face had blurred slightly during the exposure because she had, of course, been unable to hold entirely still. Della held the case in both hands for a long moment. She had wondered as she read the letters through the long night in November what these people had looked like. She had not permitted herself to imagine faces because she had known that whatever faces she imagined would be wrong. Here were the true faces held bright and small in a plate of silver-treated copper on a mountain in the Bitterroots 36 years after the shutter had opened in a studio in Boston. Josephine at 18 looked out at her with the mouth of a young woman who had already begun to suspect that her life would ask more of her than she had planned to give and had decided with a small private set of her chin to give it. Beneath the daguerreotype, at the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a fifth piece of muslin and folded once, lay a single sheet of the same laid paper as the journal. It had never been sent. Della understood this at once from the absence of any address, from the ink still saturated in its downstrokes, from the small dark thumbprint on the lower left corner where the writer had touched her own smudge before it had dried. The date at the top read the 15th of October, 1852. The hand was Josephine's. If any soul should find these lines in some later season, I have not thought when I sat down to write, whether they should ever be found or whether I write them only for the comfort of the writing. The truth is that I turned 21 yesterday, and my mother made me a cake from the last of the sugar, and I have not been able to sleep for the thinking of it. There is nothing to be said of a cake that has not been said better by every mother who has ever laid a small thing before a child and called it a feast. What I mean to write is this: if any soul in any winter that follows mine should shelter here in a storm and open this box, know that we were here. Know that my father cut those words above the stove for you. Know that my mother made a cake for me from a spoonful of sugar she hid 2 months before the day. Know that if you are cold, there is wood in the crib. Know that if you are frightened, the storm always ends. Know that if you are alone tonight, you are not the first to be alone in this room, and you will not be the last, and the ones before you thought of you when they could, and hope that in your turn you would think of the ones who come after. My father says a family is not made only of the blood we share, but of the light we leave for those who follow. I did not at the time he said it entirely understand him. I think tonight that I begin to. Whoever you are, I am glad the door held. I am glad the flue drew. I am glad you are warm. Sleep well. It was signed in the same young hand, Josephine Halloran, of no fixed place, but for the present of Copper Ridge in the territory of the West. Della read the letter through once. She read it through a second time. She did not weep at the reading. She had wept the previous month at another page, and this was not the same page, and it did not ask for the same tears. What she felt was quieter and stranger, the small, unmistakable sensation of being addressed. Not remembered, not memorialized. Addressed. Josephine Halloran, at 21 years and 1 day of age, sitting at a plank table in a cabin she would leave in the spring, had reached forward through 32 winters and had spoken directly and by name to a young woman she could not have imagined, and the young woman she could not have imagined had turned out to be exactly the young woman she had spoken to. It was not a matter of coincidence. Coincidences did not in Della's experience feel like this. This felt like a door being opened in a house older than either of them by two people who had happened to reach for the same handle from opposite sides. She folded the letter along its original crease. She placed it back into the muslin. She placed the muslin back into the box. She closed the lid. She rose and she stepped outside into the cold, pale afternoon, and she stood for a long moment looking east down the drainage toward the plains, where a low sun was breaking through the clouds in long amber shafts, and she permitted herself for perhaps 20 seconds to feel the exact shape of what had happened to her. By the 3rd week of December, the letters were safe. That was the first thing. They had been carried down off Copper Ridge in the cedar box, wheeled south to Deer Lodge, in a wagon under Cody Renner's escort, and thence delivered to the vaults of the Montana Historical Society in Helena, where the president himself, a Mr. Alden Foss, formerly of Yale College, who had never in his life stood inside a wagon cabin, but who had wept openly. So Harriet Ashby wrote upon reading Josephine's unposted letter, had ordered them placed under glass in the Society's principal case, above a small brass plaque bearing the words, "The Halloran Papers, a gift of the frontier to the present." The cabin itself remained on Copper Ridge. It was too fragile to move. It had been surveyed and photographed and legally designated on the 10th of December as the first officially protected historic structure in the territory of Montana, and it would receive in the following summer a modest weatherproofing under the supervision of Mr. Foss and a small crew hired out of Silverbow. Silas Merrick had been engaged without being asked as its permanent warden. He had accepted in a single sentence delivered to Wendell Ashby at the ranch kitchen table that this was work he was already doing, and he saw no reason to charge for it. And Wendell had answered that a wage was not a payment for work, but a marker of a man's standing. And Silas, after a long silence, had accepted $1 a week to be sent up in the spring with the salt and the coffee. The second thing that came clear in that third week of December was the whereabouts of Josephine Halloran. It came through a letter from Salem in the state of Oregon written in a hand. Della now knew from the last entry in the Bible register. Harriet Ashby had written to the postmaster at Salem in the second week of November on the strength of the addresses in the journal, requesting any information he could give her regarding a family named Halloran who had passed into the town in the fall of 1853. The postmaster had answered by return mail with the address of a boarding house near the Willamette University campus, kept by a widow of the name Josephine Halloran Trask, a school teacher of long standing in the district, now in her 53rd year in good health in receipt of the small pension of her late husband, and the postmaster added in a hand that had warmed considerably by the second page, a lady of such general kindness that no letter directed to her would fail of a courteous reply. Della composed her own letter for 4 evenings. She discarded 3 complete drafts. What she finally sent was short. She wrote that a young woman in Montana Territory had spent the night of the 14th of October, 1884, in a small cabin on a ridge above the Bitterroot, and that on that night she had read a page written by a young woman of 21 years old on the 14th of October, 1852, and that the reading of that page had in a fashion she could not easily explain changed the direction of the reader's life. She wrote that she was returning in a separate parcel by the same post the family daguerreotype and the family Bible, and the pocket watch of Mr. Thomas Halloran, which she believed rightfully to be Josephine's, and which she asked to be received with her respects. She wrote that she hoped Josephine, now Mrs. Trask, would not think it forward if the young woman in Montana were to write again in the spring, and if a correspondence, however occasional, might be permitted to take root between them. She signed the letter Adelaide Whitmore of the Ashby Ranch above Silverbow Crossing, Montana Territory. She sent it on the 20th of December. She did not expect a reply before March. The third thing that came clear in December was where Della herself would live. She had not asked. That was not her way. The offer, when it came, was made in a manner so quiet that she almost missed it. She was in the kitchen of the Ashby Ranch house on the evening of the 22nd, drying dishes at the sink, while Harriet Ashby stood at the great table shelling walnuts for a pie. There had been a discussion earlier that day in the front room of the school at the settlement 2 miles down the creek, a one-room affair held in the loft above the blacksmiths taught in the winter, by whichever of the ranch wives could be spared. The current teacher, a Mrs. Endicott, had received word by the week's post that her sister in Cheyenne had taken a decline, and Mrs. Endicott would be leaving after the new year for as long as her sister required her. Harriet cracked a walnut against the block with a small brass hammer. She spoke without looking up. "Wendell and I have discussed it. The children of the creek will require an assistant teacher come January and a teacher of their own by the fall if Mrs. Endicott's sister does not mend. You have the letters. You have the hand. You have, more to the point, the disposition. It would be a favor to us if you would consider staying. There is the small cottage behind the horse barn that has stood empty since our foreman's daughter married. It is not much. It has a stove and a window and a door that closes properly. It would be yours for as long as you wished it. The wage would be $12 a month to start, which I understand is what the school at Fort Benton is offering, so we do not undervalue you. You would take your meals with us when you wished, or on your own when you wished. Wendell has already spoken to Mr. Baird at the blacksmith about the loft." Della dried the plate in her hands very slowly. She turned it once. She set it on the stack. She dried the next one. She could not speak for a moment. What she felt was not the sharp gratitude that she had known often in her life at small kindnesses given by strangers who would forget her by the following week. What she felt was the strange, steady weight of being planned for. "Wendell and I have discussed it, not on impulse, not in the flush of a rescued cabin, in discussion over some number of evenings in a house whose kitchen she had passed through only 3 times by 2 people who had made a place for her at a school 2 miles down the creek, and had already spoken to the blacksmith about the loft. She thought unbidden of a woman she would never meet in a Boston kitchen in August of '52, hiding a spoonful of sugar into a tin. It was she understood the same species of gesture. It was the taking of thought in advance for a person one loved without asking whether the love had yet been earned. She dried the plate. She set it on the stack. Her voice when she found it was steadier than she had feared. "I would be glad to stay, ma'am. I am much obliged." Harriet Ashby cracked another walnut. She did not look up. "Well," she said, "that is settled then. See if you can fetch me the sifter. This pie will not shell itself." The winter passed. It did not pass quickly. The snows came heavier in January than they had in November, and the creek froze to a depth of 8 inches, and Cody Renner broke his wrist bringing down a spooked yearling in the upper corral. The one-room school opened in the loft above the blacksmith's on the 4th of January, with Della as the assistant teacher and Mrs. Endicott's cousin, a Miss Prudence Weaver, out of the settlement below as the senior. Della had 11 pupils in her charge ranging in age from 6 to 14, and by the second week of instruction, she had discovered that she loved the work in a way she had not loved any work before. She loved the small, stubborn children who could not sit still. She loved the older girls who came to her with questions about spelling that were really questions about the shapes of their own futures. She loved the moment in the middle of the afternoon when the door of the loft would open, and Silas Merrick, who came down once a month for salt and coffee, and increasingly for reasons he did not clearly state, would stand at the back of the room in his buckskin coat with a small wrapped parcel under his arm, and would wait until the lesson had ended before crossing to her desk to place upon it whatever book he had found for her in Missoula that month. The books were second-hand and various, a Whittier one month, a battered Dickens the next, a text on plain geometry that had once belonged to a cavalry lieutenant killed in '76, and Della understood, though he never said it, that Silas Merrick had come in his 66th year to require the small ceremony of the placing of a book upon her desk, in the way that some men require at that age, the placing of a hand upon a grandchild's head. The letter from Salem came on the 3rd of April. It was carried up from the settlement by Cody Renner, whose wrist had mended, and it was in Della's hand by supper time. She did not open it in front of the household. She carried it out to the small cottage behind the horse barn, which had in 3 months become, in a quiet, unspectacular fashion, her home, the first she had ever thought of by that word, and she sat down on the pine chair beside the small stove, and she broke the seal. The hand was the hand from the register in the family Bible. It had thickened slightly with the years, but the loops of the letters remained the loops of the girl who had once at 18 sat for a Boston daguerreotype with her mother's mouth and her father's brow. "Dear Miss Whitmore," the letter began, "I have received your parcel, and I have read your letter, and I have sat with both for some little time before permitting myself to answer. I did not know until your letter came that any of my father's papers still existed. I had believed them lost in a fire at Fort Owen. In the spring of the year, we left the mountains, along with a good many other things that had passed through my mother's hands. The finding of them and the return to my keeping of my father's watch and the family record is a kindness I had not thought to receive at this end of my life. I thank you for it. I thank you also for the daguerreotype, which I confess I had forgotten entirely, and which upon opening the case brought back to me the smell of the studio in State Street and the impatient patience of the photographer, who had, if I recall rightly, 6 children of his own and no fondness for the sittings of anyone else's. My mother has been gone these 7 years. My father these 14. My brother Finn lives at Corvallis with his wife and 4 sons, of whom the eldest is now the age I was in the picture. My sister Maisie is a schoolmistress in Astoria and does not marry, which is a decision she has made on her own considered grounds and which I have long since ceased to argue with her about. I write next to what you have not asked, but what I think you have wished me to answer. On the night of the 14th of October in the year 1852, I did indeed sit at my father's table and eat a cake my mother had made from a spoonful of sugar and 2 eggs and the last grease in the pan. I remember the cake. I remember it more clearly than any meal I have eaten since. I did indeed take up my father's pen the next morning and write a letter to no one because there was no one to write to, and I sealed it in the oiled cloth because I could not bear to burn it, and I could not bear to keep it in a place where anyone I knew might read it. I put it beneath the hearthstone myself. I remember the exact stone. I told no one what I had done. I had almost forgotten it. Your telling of it back to me 32 years later has been a strange and moving thing to sit with, and I have sat with it for a full week before I could bring myself to write these lines. I do not know what to say to you about the night you spent there. I know from your letter that you are a young woman without a family of your own, and that you found in a small paper of mine something that spoke to you. I have no wisdom to offer you about the loneliness of a girl at 21 who does not know her mother. I did know mine, and it did not spare me all sorrow, and it did not spare her all sorrow either. What I would say instead, if you will allow me, the liberty is this. I have thought many times in my life of the strangers who might one day come across our cabin in a storm. I did not imagine any one of them clearly. I only hoped that if they were cold, the door would hold, and if they were frightened, the flue would draw, and if they were alone, the letters, should they read them, would not seem to them the letters of people who had forgotten they might be read. It seems that you were one of those strangers. I am very glad the door held. I am very glad you were warm. I would be glad to receive further letters from you at whatever season and whatever length you please. The spring here has begun early, and the roses my late husband set out along the front porch have begun to open, and I sit to write this in a chair he made for me the second year of our marriage. I am, though I have never met you, very fond of you. Please write again. Yours truly, Josephine Halloran Trask. Della read the letter 3 times. She folded it. She placed it in the shallow drawer of the small pine table beneath the window, on top of a copy of the poems of John Greenleaf Whittier that Silas Merrick had placed upon her desk in February. She sat for a long moment with her hand on the drawer, and she looked out the small window at the last of the April light lying gold across the corral fence, and she thought without any particular drama that she would answer the letter in the morning, and that she would answer every letter Josephine Halloran Trask cared to send her for the rest of either of their lives, and that this too, this weekly small commerce of ink across a distance of 800 miles, was a form of family. Not the only form, not any longer even the primary form, but a form, a true one. Her 22nd birthday came on a warm October afternoon in the following year. The aspens along the creek had turned to a pale yellow that trembled at the least breath of wind, and the hay in the upper meadow had been in the barn a month, and the smell of wood smoke had begun to hang low along the ranch buildings in the evenings, the way it hangs in country where the nights are drawing in. Della came in from the school at 4 o'clock. The kitchen of the ranch house was warm. Harriet Ashby was at the stove. Wendell was at the head of the great table with the county newspaper open to the market prices, which he was reading aloud to no one in particular. Silas Merrick, cleanly shaved for the first time in Della's memory, sat at Wendell's left hand, turning a coffee cup slowly between his palms. In front of the empty chair at the foot of the table lay a small round cake, no larger than a saucer, with 2 thin candles burning steadily in its center. Beside the cake lay a small square jeweler's box of dark blue leather. Harriet did not turn from the stove. "Sit," she said in the same tone she had once used at the Higgins Hotel. "The tea is nearly ready." Della sat. She looked at the cake. She looked at the box. She did not immediately open either. "The cake is only cake," Harriet said. "We did not know what your favorite was." Wendell insisted on the candles. "He is sentimental about candles. He is not sentimental about anything else." "That is not true," Wendell said without looking up from the market prices. "I am sentimental about horses, and about a certain schoolmistress, though I have not yet informed her of the fact." Silas made a small sound in his throat that in any other man would have been a laugh. Della opened the box. Inside, on a bed of white cotton, lay a silver locket. It was oval, no larger than the pad of a thumb, hung on a chain of proper length, its front entirely blank of engraving. It had been made new. She could tell by the small, clean brightness of the silver unclouded by any age. It had been made new, and it had been made blank on purpose. Harriet came to the table with the teapot. She poured first for Wendell, then for Silas, then for Della, then for herself. She sat down at Wendell's right hand. She did not look at Della directly. She spoke to the cake. "A woman is entitled to more than one locket in her life. The one you carry is your mother's. You will always carry it, and you should. This one is yours. It has no letters on it because we did not presume to choose them for you. You will decide in your own time what you wish it to say, and you will have it engraved in Helena the next time one of us is down that way. Or you will leave it blank. That is also permitted. A blank locket is only a promise, and a promise is a reasonable thing to wear around one's neck." Della lifted the locket out of the box. She weighed it in her palm. It was heavier than the small silver oval at her throat, and lighter than she had expected. She was thinking many things. She was thinking of a woman who had put another small silver oval around the neck of an infant on a February night in 1863, because she could think of nothing else to give. She was thinking of another woman who had spent a spoonful of sugar over a 2-month period so that a daughter would have a cake. She was thinking of an old scout who had shaved for the first time in her memory because she was turning 22. She was thinking of a woman across the mountains in Salem who had written her 14 letters in 6 months and whose last letter arrived on the previous Thursday had begun, "My dear Della," and had ended with "All my love, Josephine." She closed her fingers around the new locket. She said, "Thank you." That was all she said. It seemed to be enough. Harriet Ashby cut the small cake into 4 pieces, and Wendell Ashby folded his newspaper, and Silas Merrick set down his coffee cup, and the 4 of them ate the smallest cake in the West, and the candles burned down to soft, pale stubs. And outside the kitchen window, the last of the October lights slid down the yellow side of the upper meadow and gathered in the tops of the aspen for one final gold moment before the evening began. Della Whitmore had never known who her mother had been. She would not in her lifetime come to know. What she had come to understand on a warm October afternoon in the year 1885, at a table in a kitchen in the upper valley above Silverbow Crossing, was that a family is not in the last accounting, only the people who bring you into a room. Sometimes a family is the hand that hides a spoonful of sugar in August against an October you have not yet named. Sometimes it is the knife that cuts 3 sentences into a pine header for a stranger who has not yet been born. Sometimes it is an old man with a blackened coat and a shaved chin, and a woman at a stove with a teapot, and a rancher at a table who is sentimental about candles, and a school teacher 800 miles west who has begun her latest letter with the word dear. Sometimes it is a light one keeps burning without knowing whose eyes will find it, in the hope that on some far night in some far storm, the door will hold and the flue will draw, and the one who comes in from the cold will know, if only for a single warm evening, that she was not after all walking through the world alone.